The story begins with a boy named Ed Rothtailor, the unruly son of a prestigious noble family who ruled over the academy like a king. As Ed sat on his bed, reading a letter he'd just received, he learned that, due to his repeated misconduct, his family had decided to remove him from the family register, accusing him of tarnishing their name. In that moment, Ed felt as though the gods of fate were mocking him, and he was powerless to change the situation. Moments later, he was thrown out of the house, with all his belongings scattered outside. A butler approached him and coldly informed Ed that everything had been taken from him. He thanked Ed for his service to the family but made it clear he was no longer needed. With that, the butler shut the door, leaving Ed standing alone. Moments later, Ed arrived at the academy, and as he walked through, the students began whispering among themselves. Their hushed conversations carried an air of gossip, with one student remarking that there was no need to tiptoe around Ed anymore, as he had apparently been disowned and had even cleared out his dorm room. Another student questioned whether they would see Ed next semester, commenting that he shouldn't have rigged the entrance exam in the first place. They added that they always knew Ed was just a corrupt noble, and this downfall was inevitable. Ed sat on a bench, on the verge of tears, feeling overwhelmed by the unfairness of it all. He thought to himself how unjustly he was being treated, as the arrogant Ed Rothtailor everyone spoke of wasn't him at all, but someone entirely different. Before becoming known as Ed, he had been just a regular person living on Earth. One day, while playing his favorite game, a fantasy set in the magic school called Sylvania Academy, something strange had happened. He had suddenly found himself inside the game, the failed swordsman of Sylvania, now living the life of a character he never imagined being. From what Ed knew from the countless webtoons he had read, entering a game usually meant possessing a powerful character, either the first son of a chaebol, a genius ruffian young clan master, or an SSS rank hunter who defied all the rules. But out of all those possibilities, he had ended up as a third-rate villain who got kicked out of the dorms at the start of the game and, to make matters worse, was disowned by his family. Ed thought he had drawn the worst possible character at the worst time. Growing furious as he reflected on his situation, he shouted in anger, feeling that it was incredibly unfair and hard to believe that this was happening to him. He yelled that he had always lived a simple, frugal life without greed, but the other students, hearing his outburst, found it hard to believe he was claiming unfair treatment after everything he had done. One of the students pointed at Ed, telling him he had no right to call himself frugal and simple, and added that he was a scumbag and shameless. With that, they walked away. As the students left, Ed felt a small sense of relief, knowing he wouldn't have to hear their insults any longer. He then decided to check his stats, hoping for some reassurance. But as he looked, Ed was speechless. His stats were shockingly low, so low that even a farmer NPC would have better stats. The disbelief deepened as he thought about how the previous Ed had been attending the Faculty of Magic, yet his intellect was abysmally low, and his stamina was nowhere near what it should be for a noble like him. Ed thought to himself that it was no wonder the character was just a third-rate, trampy villain who only appeared in the early scenarios. He was weak and insignificant. Even in his own memories of playing the game, Ed could barely recall this character because he was so unimportant, a minor villain who didn't affect the story in any meaningful way. As he tried to piece together what happened to the character later in the game, Ed suddenly remembered. In the corner of the ending credits, he had seen Ed, reduced to begging, looking like a pitiful bum. Ed turned pale as he recalled his future. It was no surprise, he thought, that this fate awaited him. The previous Ed had been a ruffian who knew nothing about the world, suddenly thrown onto the streets. Ed considered himself lucky that the original Ed had even survived. Grabbing his luggage, he questioned why he had been reincarnated into this body and wondered how he had come to possess it in the first place. He realized he had no answers, nor any way of finding out. But with a newfound determination, Ed resolved that this would not be his fate. He promised himself he would change his destiny and succeed, no matter what. Rather than just a school, the academy was more like a vast city, with the entire Arkan Mountains as its grounds. The place where Ed found himself was in the undeveloped forest on the northeastern edge of the academy. Trying to avoid the prying eyes of the students, Ed had walked for half a day. This gave him plenty of time to process the situation he was in. Being disowned marked a pivotal moment in the scenario, but fortunately, despite losing his family's support, he hadn't been expelled from the academy. This was crucial, as Sylvania Academy was one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. Graduating from Sylvania Academy guaranteed a secure future, and as long as Ed remained at the academy, he could fully utilize the knowledge he'd gained as a dedicated player of the game. If he could just graduate quietly, Ed knew he could live a far more comfortable and exciting life than the one he'd left behind in his previous world. With this in mind, his obvious goal became clear: to graduate from the academy and achieve the life he envisioned. The problem, however, was the enormous tuition fees. Ed reasoned that the current semester was probably already paid for, so if he could secure a scholarship for the next semester, he would be well on his way to graduation. The real issue, Ed realized, was his low stats. He wondered how he could possibly secure a scholarship with such poor numbers. Deciding to put thoughts of tuition aside for the moment, he focused on the more immediate problem: his survival. In this new reality, his priority was securing the basics: food, clothing, and shelter. Ed began to worry about how he would avoid ending up homeless in the coming week. He opened his luggage and saw that, while he had enough clothes to get by, the bigger problem was that he no longer had a place to stay after being kicked out of the dorm. Worse still, he had no food for the night. Ed realized that, given the bad reputation left by the previous Ed, finding a job would be challenging. He couldn't return to the dorm since he had been expelled, leaving him stuck in the woods for the time being. However, he felt a sense of relief knowing he was close to a nearby stream, which would make living in the forest a bit easier. With only 10 days left until school started, Ed decided he needed to prepare himself for attending classes. Moments later, he began practicing his spell, Wind Blade. As he successfully cast the spell, he felt a small sense of relief, but it quickly faded when he realized he was already exhausted from using even a little bit of magic. As Ed breathed heavily, he reflected on how fascinating it was that he felt utterly exhausted after cutting down just 15 tree trunks. This exertion had made him even hungrier, leading him to realize that the spell he was using wasn't very practical for his needs. He thought it was unfair that his family hadn't at least fed him before kicking him out, especially since he was now so hungry after pushing his body beyond its limits with magic. In that moment, he recalled something his grandfather had once told him. When his grandfather was a young boy, he would eat tree bark in the back mountains. With this memory in mind, Ed set about boiling tree bark in a cup over a hot fire ignited by his magic. At that moment, Ed thought that anything edible would suffice. He even convinced himself that if he didn't look too closely at the tree bark, it resembled chicken breast. Taking a chance, he ate the cooked bark, but as soon as he swallowed it, he immediately vomited, finding it completely unpalatable. 3 days later, Ed looked pale and gaunt, on the verge of starvation. He hadn't had any proper food during this time, and after a day of starving and 2 days of vomiting, he concluded that wood was meant for building houses, not for eating. After collecting a large amount of wood, Ed realized he needed to build a shelter. The first step was to raise the frame that would support the structure. Although he only had 2 hands and there were 4 supports to construct, he refused to give up easily. After much effort, he finally completed the shelter frame, but he knew it was still far from finished. Ed thought about how he wouldn't be able to sleep on the bare ground, and although it felt wasteful, he had no choice but to use his clothes to cover the ground. As the day passed and the next one arrived, Ed's hard work finally paid off. He had successfully built himself a small shelter. He reflected on how demanding the task had been, barely managing to finish the construction. Just then, a notification from the system appeared, informing him that his creation was complete and that his crafting proficiency had increased. The system also confirmed that he had completed the project of making a basic wood shelter, achieving the rank of novice craftsman. His handiness was now at level 4, while his design and gathering abilities remained at level 1. Looking exhausted, Ed thought about his life as a noble, realizing that although he hadn't been aware of it, he was more skilled with his hands than with magic. In his current situation, he needed that handiness more than ever while living in the forest. Moments later, the system popped up again, informing Ed that he had completed a new project and was now able to craft a simple harpoon, which further increased his crafting proficiency. Fueled by frustration, Ed decided it was time to find proper food. After 2 days on an empty stomach and enduring excessive physical labor, he thought he should be too weak to move, yet he felt more energized than ever. It was desperation that drove him forward, a desperate desire for meat. After a short while, Ed successfully caught some fish from the stream. He quickly used his fire spell to create a fire, ready to begin cooking the fish for his meal. After a few moments, Ed finished cooking the fish and began to drool at how delicious it looked. With only a week left until school started, he thought about how he just needed to hold out until then. If he could manage to get through this period, he would be able to navigate school without much trouble. However, as he contemplated this, a woman approached him and called out. Ed, about to take his first bite of the cooked fish, stopped in shock at the sight of her standing next to him. In that moment, he realized that he had been so focused on surviving that he had forgotten something important, the main characters of the game, and one of them was standing right in front of him. Ed never expected that out of all the main characters in the game, he would run into the person standing in front of him. He recalled that, in the past, this individual had once told him that he showed no signs of remorse and suggested he should simply disappear from the academy. That person was none other than Princess Fina, the one responsible for kicking him out of the dorms. Now, in the present, Fina was once again telling Ed that he should leave the academy. According to the game, the first episode revolves around Ed Rothtailor, a villain who appears as soon as the player starts. Using his status as a noble, Ed attempts to charm the main character's childhood friend, only to face punishment for his actions. Undeterred and filled with vengeance, he maliciously manipulates the main character's entrance exam for Sylvania Academy. However, he is caught by a girl taking the exam in disguise, none other than Fina Elias Kloll, the third princess of the Kloll Empire. At that moment, Fina uses her skill, insight, to uncover Ed's lies and conspiracies. Caught in a humiliating position, Ed grits his teeth and makes excuses, but Fina's insight exposes all of his deceptions, leading to his expulsion from the dorm. In that moment, Ed thought that everyone in the academy hated him, but now he had encountered the one person he most certainly should not have met, Fina. Looking a bit irritated, Fina asked Ed what he was doing there and why the academy had not expelled him yet. Troubled by her pressure, Ed replied that he was still a student at the academy, but he added that he had been chased out of the dorm. Upon hearing this, Fina's irritation grew, and she shouted at Ed to leave immediately, stating that she could not stand to see someone as shameless as him around the school. She then declared that she would speak to the academic department and personally request his expulsion. At that moment, Fina told Ed that he had committed a dishonorable act as a student of the academy. For attempting to sabotage a fellow student's path to a better future, she declared that he was unfit to remain in the academy and must leave immediately. However, Ed was not paying attention to Fina's words. Instead, his focus was on the fish grilling over the fire, which was on the verge of burning. He was worried that the fish would be ruined by the time Fina finished speaking. At that moment, Ed realized that while the burning fish was a concern, a much greater crisis loomed before him, Fina, the very person lecturing him. She had the power to expel him from the academy, and if she did, he would have to forfeit the chance at an easier future. Faced with this predicament, Ed understood that he had no choice but to confront the situation head-on. As Fina continued speaking, he interrupted her, pointing out that the sun was about to set. He added that royalty was typically accompanied by heavily armed guards, questioning why a noble princess would venture into such an isolated forest alone. He said this while looking at Fina with a menacing expression. Fina immediately became wary of Ed and released her magic, warning him that if he was attempting to threaten her in light of her lack of escorts, he would deeply regret it. In response, Ed knelt on one knee and asked Fina what she meant, claiming he was simply trying to thank her. Confused by his words, Fina activated her insight skill to determine if Ed was lying. To her surprise, the spell revealed that he was indeed telling the truth, with no deceit present in Ed Rothtailor's words. Ed observed Fina's expression and noted her surprise upon discovering that he was being honest. The Rothtailor family to which Ed belonged was famous and influential, but they exploited citizens and conducted human experiments in their quest for eternal life. As a result, the main character of the game viewed the Rothtailor family as a corrupt dynasty that needed to be destroyed. Ed recalled from his gameplay that the members of the Rothtailor family would eventually face imprisonment or execution. However, he had been disowned before this fate befell them, allowing him to survive. At that moment, a system notification appeared, informing Ed that he had created a burnt fish that was no longer suitable for consumption. Ed thought to himself that although he was cold and hungry, it was still better than dying, and in the long run, this situation might actually work out for him. He realized he needed to convince Phinia without resorting to lies. Otherwise, he risked expulsion, which would mean game over for him. As he considered the timeline, he remembered that Ed Rothtailor was expelled about a week before school started, prompting him to wonder what could have brought Princess Phinia to confront him in that moment. Rising to his feet, he pointed out to Phinia that her decision to come to the forest alone, dressed in simple clothing, suggested she might have been completing the class placement test. Before regular classes began, Professor Glast assigned the Academy students a quest that determined their class placement. The task involved finding magic beads hidden in the forest. Ed informed Phinia that Professor Glast's tests were notorious for being quite challenging and added that, as a noble princess, she would likely aim for the top tier, Class A. Phinia, however, questioned whether Ed was trying to flatter her and remarked that he hadn't changed at all. As expected, she insisted she should request the Academy to expel him on the spot. In response, Ed stepped closer, adopting a serious expression, and told her that without his assistance, she would not be able to secure a spot in Class A. Ed then asserted that if he were lying, Phinia could expel him immediately, leaving her shocked at his audacity. He continued, explaining that if she went to the lake in the southeast of the forest, she would find a small grassy island with a giant tree at its center, the Marilda's guardian tree. There, Phinia would discover the gift Ed had left for her. As she followed his directions, she eventually found the present he had mentioned. At that moment, Phinia reflected on the Ed Rothtailor from 3 days ago, recalling him as a liar and charlatan, in a pitiful state. However, the Ed she faced now was undeniably different from the one she remembered. Moments later, Professor Glast announced that the class placement test had officially concluded, and the students were to reveal the beads they had collected. 4 students stepped forward to display their beads, but upon seeing them, Professor Glast informed them that they would all be starting in Class F, leaving them visibly disappointed. It was crucial to understand the examiner's intent in this test, as it was not merely about finding any magic bead. Professor Glast explained that only those who discovered beads infused with magical power would qualify for Class A. He then held up the beads in his hands, revealing that only 3 students had found this type. Professor Glast began announcing the names of the students who had found the magic beads: Zix, Lortel, and lastly, he revealed that the final student who had discovered a bead at the guardian tree of Marilda had an unusually high magic power. As he said this, he pointed toward Phinia, declaring that she would be at the top of the class. Meanwhile, in a different part of the forest, Ed was tying bait onto his fishing pole, reflecting on how the fish he had grilled was now burnt. On top of that, he felt too weak to use a spear any longer. At that moment, the system popped up to inform Ed that he had created a crude fishing rod, but he felt no excitement about this achievement. Ed reflected that Phinia, the 3rd princess of the empire, had seen through flattery and sophistry since she was young. This ability had sharpened her insight and led to the development of her innate skill, making it impossible for anyone to escape her perception. As a result, he had no choice but to provide her with authentic information. However, this also posed a greater problem. If the proud Princess Phinia, who was known as the Princess of Love, were to fail the class placement test and fall into Class F, her circumstances would begin to change. Ed realized that if Phinia, with her significant influence over the early events of the story, discovered the golden bead and entered Class A, it would disrupt the original narrative and prevent her from being relegated to Class F. Ed realized that even if he managed to avoid expulsion, all the information he possessed would become useless, leaving him in a precarious situation. He also considered the possibility that the future might not change even if Phinia were placed in Class A. Meanwhile, Phinia reflected on her skill of insight, which always revealed the truth. She acknowledged that the bead Ed mentioned truly existed, confirming that he had not lied to her. However, despite receiving the bead as a present from Ed, she felt unhappy about the situation. Ed questioned why Princess Phinia had concealed her identity in the first place. The answer lay in her embarrassment over the special treatment she would receive if her true status were revealed. Phinia wanted to prove her worth, and she recognized that simply obtaining the bead would not reflect her own efforts. She understood that her future title as the Princess of Love would not stem from skills or statistics, but from walking a righteous path. By informing Phinia about the bead, Ed had effectively set a trap for her, suggesting that if she truly believed he was lying and that she could never enter Class A, she could have him expelled immediately. Whether Ed's words were true or false likely did not matter, as the princess could always discern the reality of the situation. Even if Ed genuinely believed that Phinia would fail the test while she was confident in her success, he did not lie when he told her that she could not enter Class A without his assistance. Recognizing this truth, Phinia had no choice but to accept his help. Annoyed at the thought of being aided by Ed, she resolved to keep a closer watch on him from that moment onward. Ed was fishing alone when he successfully caught another fish, filling him with excitement at the prospect of finally having something to eat. As time passed, it became the opening day of school, and Ed realized he would need to start running early in the morning to make it to class on time. After a few minutes, he finally arrived at Sylvania Academy. Shortly thereafter, the head of the academy announced the start of the school opening ceremony, expressing pleasure at seeing the progress the students had made before the new semester began. He encouraged the students to enjoy the food that had been prepared while listening to the announcements being made. As Ed sat alone, he could hear the hushed whispers of other students talking disparagingly about him. They expressed disbelief that he had the audacity to return to the academy for the opening ceremony, questioning whether he truly intended to continue attending after everything he had done. Despite their remarks, Ed paid them no mind and slowly enjoyed his meal, which had been prepared for the students. His goal was not to make friends but to graduate from the academy, so their negative comments didn't bother him. Among the group of 3 students discussing Ed, one of them looked closer and noticed something different about him. He seemed to be behaving unusually and was not his typical self. Ed thought to himself that he had no ambitions at all. He simply wanted to graduate and hoped that nothing would happen to him during his time at the academy. This day marked the beginning of a new semester at Sylvania, and while he felt excitement about starting fresh, he nearly faced expulsion on the very first day. As Ed emerged from the dean's office, he looked lifeless, having not anticipated that Phinia would report him. However, the way the cranky old dean spoke to him with a smile suggested that Phinia hadn't said anything detrimental about him. Ed realized he had narrowly avoided trouble and reminded himself to be cautious moving forward. Ed wore a serious expression as he reminded himself to pay close attention and avoid actions that could draw unwanted attention, ensuring the game's story stayed true to its original course. He recognized the need to hone his survival skills and engage in magic training befitting a student of the Faculty of Magic. Ed concluded that the best way to combine these skills was through the use of a bow. He also noted that as his life skills improved, he would be able to craft high-quality arrows and infuse them with spirit magic formulas. As Ed considered what he needed to do to survive, he was surprised to spot a familiar face in the distance, Yannicka Faylover, the top student of her class and a renowned genius spirit sorcerer. Ed recognized her from the game, and to his surprise, Yannicka turned towards him and remarked that he was the amusing guy Marilda had been talking about. Unsure how to respond, Ed stayed silent as Yannicka approached him. Introducing herself as Yannicka Faylover, she mentioned that she was also a second-year student, just like Ed, and assured him he could simply call her Yannicka. Seeing Yannicka, Ed wondered when she had arrived. She seemed to notice his surprise and asked if he was surprised that she knew about him. She explained that the forest they were in was under the protection of Marilda, a high-ranking spirit, and that she had heard plenty about Ed from Marilda, as he had been living there. Ed was startled to realize that the master of the forest had been talking about him to Yannicka. Yannicka continued, mentioning that Marilda was rather nosy, and with her awareness spread across the forest, it was only natural she would notice an uninvited visitor like Ed. Feeling slightly uneasy at being called an unwanted guest, Ed reflected that, given how many animals he had hunted and trees he had cut down, the title was probably well-deserved. Seeing Ed looking troubled by her remarks, Yannicka reassured him not to worry about minor details, explaining that it was the natural order for creatures in the forest to hunt and eat one another. She added that Marilda wasn't bothered by Ed residing in her forest either. Feeling slightly embarrassed, Ed replied that he guessed even a fierce wolf could have a tender heart. Yannicka looked a bit puzzled by his comment, noting it was quite unexpected. Shifting the conversation, she mentioned that there was something she wanted to show him. Yannicka extended her hand to reveal a spirit resting there, telling Ed it was cute and adorable. She explained that she had signed a contract with the spirit the previous day as soon as she saw it, and asked if he would like to touch it. Surprised to learn she had formed a contract with a spirit, Ed thought to himself that to befriend Yannicka, he just needed to respond at the right moments. With this in mind, Ed told Yannicka that he didn't quite understand what she was referring to, as he couldn't see any spirit in her hand, adding that he was unable to see spirits. Yannicka was surprised that Ed couldn't see spirits, but before she could respond, he shifted the topic, mentioning he had come to the area to gather food. He then excused himself and began walking away. As he left, Ed thought to himself that only by adhering to the original storyline could he gain a strategic advantage, and he reminded himself that Yannicka Failover held significant importance in that storyline, someone he should keep his distance from. Meanwhile, as Yannicka watched him walk away, she recalled his comment about a fierce wolf having a tender heart. Standing next to the massive wolf spirit Marilda, Yannicka remarked to her that Ed was indeed as fascinating as Marilda had described. Yannicka remarked to Marilda that, try as she might, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ed truly wasn't able to see Marilda, leaving her curious about who he really was. Resting her head against Marilda, Yannicka felt a bit frustrated that Ed hadn't reacted to her as she had hoped. Despite her genuine efforts to be kind, his responses remained distant and half-hearted. She wondered what she could do to improve their relationship. Then, realizing there was no need to overthink it, she reminded herself that it wasn't as though she wouldn't see Ed again. She could easily locate him anywhere in the forest. The next day, Ed reflected that the distance between his shelter and the academy was anything but short. As he ran towards the school, he realized he was barely making it in time, even after leaving at dawn and sprinting at full speed. Just commuting was a grueling task that boosted his stats. Determined to win the scholarship, Ed resolved to study more diligently. He planned to write notes on a stone slab using a burned stick and borrow books from the student library. Along the way, he would wash his sweaty clothes for daily wear. But his day didn't end there. He still needed to check if he had enough firewood, drinking water, and jerky prepared for the next day's lunch. All this work meant he only managed about 4 hours of sleep each night. Of all the tasks Ed had to manage each day, what bothered him most wasn't the workload, it was Yannicka observing him at every step. Finally, Ed called out to her, asking how long she intended to keep following him. Yannicka, surprised that he'd noticed her, was caught off guard. Ed, seeing her reaction, pointed out that it would be stranger if he hadn't noticed her presence. Frustrated, he told her he was Ed Rothtailor, infamous as the worst hooligan around, and demanded to know why she continued to linger near him. Just as Ed was saying this, Yannicka interrupted, telling him that this was merely how others perceived him, not how she saw him. With a bright smile, she added that she couldn't judge him like that, as she didn't even know him yet. Ed was surprised by her words. He recalled Yannicka's character from the game, a student who, despite seeming naive and innocent, was remarkably independent-minded. Yet, knowing what lay ahead for her, he found it impossible to return her smile. Yannicka Failover was, after all, the final boss of Act 1. Ed recalled that Yannicka was the only character who ever smiled at him, so he realized he had no choice but to do something that would ruin his reputation in her eyes. Seizing the moment, he told Yannicka that, since fate had brought them together, he had a favor to ask. Yannicka, intrigued, eagerly awaited his request. But Ed, putting on a troubled expression, explained that he was in a difficult situation. He was a mess and had been disowned by his family, leaving him in desperate need of money. He then asked if she could lend him some. Yannicka froze, shocked by his unexpected request. Ed quickly reassured Yannicka that he intended to pay her back, emphasizing that as friends, they should help each other out. He explained that he would only be borrowing her money temporarily and then asked how much she had with her. As he spoke, he recalled that Yannicka received a scholarship every year for being the top of her class, which reflected her academic significance. However, her background was quite poor. Without that scholarship, she wouldn't be able to enroll or progress in her studies, as she was the daughter of a small rancher. Ed recognized that her greatest weakness was her lack of financial resources. Yannicka remained in a state of shock, and eventually, she apologized to Ed, admitting that she had no money to offer him. Seeing her distressed expression made Ed feel guilty for putting her in that position, but he felt he had no choice since she was always following him. 3 days later, while hunting for animals, Ed still recalled the look on Yonika's face when he asked her for money. He felt uneasy about what he had done, but he was determined to distance himself from the important characters. Resolving to be more cautious, he told himself that he needed to stay on track so that the story wouldn't deviate from its original path. Moments later, Ed reached his shelter, but just as he was about to enter, he fell to his knees in shock. Inside his shelter was a person sleeping who had an even greater presence than Yonika. This was Lucy Merrill, the subject of admiration among her classmates and professors, a rare genius and the most powerful character in The Failed Swordsman of Sylvania. As Lucy began to wake up, Ed was left wondering why she was sleeping in his shelter and what she was doing in the mountain valley. Lucy spoke up, saying that the noise was too loud, making it difficult for her to sleep. Confused, Ed asked her what he had done to disturb her. Lucy clarified that it wasn't him making the noise. Instead, it was a wolf the size of a house standing behind him, which had been talking to Ed. Shocked by her words, Ed turned to look at the wolf. At that moment, Lucy relayed the wolf's message, explaining that it was asking Ed if he would one day save Yonika at all costs. Ed was taken aback by this revelation. As Ed went about his usual tasks over the next 2 days, he realized that Lucy had been in his camp the entire time. He wondered if this situation might lead to any significant changes in the story. However, it didn't take long for him to recognize how complacent the thought was. At that moment, the system displayed a quest for Ed, informing him about a joint combat training session. This training was essentially a mock one-on-one combat exercise where combat students primarily used fake weapons to minimize lethality. The list of participants was extensive, including benevolent Princess Phenia, golden daughter Lortel, spirit sorcerer Yonika, slothful Lucy, and wicked Clebius. Yet, despite the numerous names, the most important character remained the protagonist, the failing swordsman Taylor. Ed felt excited about the students participating in the joint combat training, wondering if Taylor's match, the main protagonist of the game, would start soon. Having already played the game, he knew the outcome, so he didn't pay much attention to the matches. In this training episode, the winners of the duels were mostly first-year students like Taylor, with one exception, Yonika. Just then, she appeared out of nowhere, looking bright and cheerful as she approached him. Ed couldn't believe that Yonika was so happily running toward him after their awkward encounter about money. Unlike Lucy, who was clearly from the cat family, it was obvious to Ed that Yonika belonged to the dog family. With a smile, Yonika informed Ed that the list of matches was out, but he appeared unbothered by her news. He told her that he wasn't particularly interested in the list of participants. Curious, Yonika asked why he felt that way and whether he was uninterested in his own match. Hearing this left Ed in shock. He had no idea he was participating in the joint combat training. As he glanced at the list, he thought to himself that Ed Rothtaylor was already expelled by this point in the original storyline. He wondered who his opponent would be, and as he looked closer at the list, he was stunned to discover the identity of his opponent. Moments later, it was time for Taylor's fight. Looking confident and determined, Taylor announced to everyone that he would perform to the best of his ability. Hearing this, Ed thought that it didn't matter who Taylor was facing, he needed to pay attention to the current match. Although it was a world beyond the screen, Ed had lived as Taylor for so long while playing the game. He had experienced everything from miserable, vain bad endings to true endings that left lasting impressions. Ed had traversed that journey countless times, and among all the routes he took, not a single one had been easy for Taylor. While Ed had already decided to focus on his own life, he was determined to cheer for Taylor with all his heart, feeling a special connection to him after having played as Taylor for so long. An announcement was made, calling for Lucy Merrill and inquiring if anyone had seen her, as her match was about to start. Ed was shocked by this announcement. It continued, instructing Lucy to come to the arena once she was ready for the practice match. Just then, Lucy appeared, yawning and looking as though she had just woken up from a deep sleep. As she stepped into the arena, the match between Taylor and Lucy began. Taylor, the protagonist of the world and a born swordsman, had never held a sword before in his life. Yet, with the first swing of his sword, he managed to cut through Lucy's lightning-quick magic. Lucy was taken aback. The spell she had expected to hit was unexpectedly blocked. Caught off guard, she watched as Taylor closed the distance between them. Surprised, Lucy struck Taylor with a lightning bolt, an intermediate-level lightning magic. Taylor was completely overpowered by the reflexively cast spell, but Lucy was disqualified for using intermediate-level magic. This decision earned Taylor the honor of being the first to defeat Lucy Merrill, creating a legendary scene. Ed was filled with emotion as he recalled this moment from the game, tears welling in his eyes at the touching memory. Just as Ed was reminiscing about his time playing the game, the match began. Taylor charged at Lucy with his bare fists, and just as he was about to deliver an attack, Lucy cast her magic spell. The blast hit Taylor, sending him flying backward with tremendous force. Everyone, including Ed, was shocked by the scene they had just witnessed, while Lucy continued to yawn, still feeling sleepy. The audience was surprised that the fight had ended so quickly, and one student remarked that it was expected since no one could defeat the top of the class. Another student commented that it was no wonder the outcome was as it was, considering Taylor was fighting against Lucy, a mage, with nothing but his bare hands. Ed thought to himself that Taylor McClure's life had always been a series of trials. A country bumpkin and a failure of a student, Taylor was an underachiever who had not received a single decent grade since starting school. He was a failure overlooked by everyone, yet amid the pity and despair that surrounded him as people jumped to conclusions about the match, Taylor never lost hope. Despite being battered, he got back up, determined to keep fighting. Ed smiled, knowing the fight between Taylor and Lucy was far from over. As Taylor picked up the sword lying on the ground, he charged toward Lucy, calling out her name, which took her by surprise. Ed smiled, knowing exactly what the next scene would entail. He anticipated that Lucy would use her intermediate spell, leading to her disqualification and Taylor's victory. However, he was taken aback when he saw that Lucy was not using an intermediate spell at all. Instead, she was casting a weaker form of magic. In that moment, as Taylor shouted in anger and poured all his strength into his attack, Lucy's magic sent him flying out of the arena. Ed was so shocked by what had just unfolded that he was at a loss for how to react. He couldn't believe that Lucy had chosen to use wind magic instead of the lightning magic he had expected. Soon after, an announcement declared Lucy Merrill the victor. The audience erupted in excitement, while Ed remained stunned by the fact that the main protagonist, Taylor, had lost the duel against Lucy. After recovering a bit from his fight against Lucy, Taylor got up and began walking away from the arena, his heart heavy with disappointment. Ed, seeing this, thought to himself that it was a problem he couldn't ignore. He definitely couldn't leave Taylor alone in that state. He recalled that the last magic Lucy had used against Taylor, delivering the final blow, was known as the protection of the wind. This spell, which used the power of the wind spirit, provided automatic defense against sudden attacks and was a continuous magic obtained through a contract with the high-class wind spirit, Marilda. In that moment, Ed took off running toward Taylor. As he passed by Lucy, she called out, asking him to give her some jerky, but Ed didn't pay her any attention and continued on his way to Taylor. Ed realized that, according to the scenario, Marilda and Lucy were originally two separate entities. However, with Lucy now allied with Ed, he had ended up contracting with Marilda and gaining strength because of it. He understood that Taylor had to win, but ultimately, he lost the fight because of Ed's presence at the academy, which had altered the course of the story. Ed knew he had to take action regarding the situation. Just then, an announcement was made, stating that the next combat would be between Ed Rothtaylor and the esteemed Princess Phineas Elias Clole. At that moment, Phineas stood before Ed, ready to speak, but he ignored her and continued on his way to where Taylor was. As Ed approached Taylor, he wondered whether what he was about to do would hold any significance, but he felt it was better than remaining inactive. Ed called out Taylor's name and assured him that his efforts would undoubtedly pay off, encouraging him not to feel so defeated and to let go of his worries. Ed thought that if Taylor's heart became completely broken, he might end up working harder in the future, a scenario Ed wanted to avoid at all costs. He continued, telling Taylor to walk proudly because he had performed well, emphasizing that it was simply a matter of facing an opponent who wasn't a good match for him. Ed urged Taylor not to let this setback bring him down. While speaking to Taylor, Ed reflected that more hardships awaited them at the academy, and it was Taylor who should confront them, not him. Moments later, he recalled that Emperor Clole was the first to discover Phenia's divine blessing at birth, recognizing her innate insight. However, Phenia's ability to detect lies and conspiracies was not a gift from any god. The life of a royal was fraught with endless intrigue and conspiracy, and it was from this dark abyss that Phenia had developed her special ability as a means of self-protection. This confidence in her abilities created an unsettling void in the eyes of the imperial family that looked up to her. Despite being aware of the truth behind those around her, the Princess of Love, Phenia, chose to live her life as if she remained oblivious to it all. Back in the present, it was time for the next match between Ed and Phenia. Standing opposite her, Ed told Phenia to go easy on him, and she replied with the same request. Meanwhile, the audience began discussing the incident where Ed had yelled at Taylor. They speculated whether Ed's actions were meant to mock someone like Taylor, who seemed incapable of defending himself. One student began spreading rumors, suggesting that Ed simply wanted to appear like a nice guy by cheering for the person he was actually picking on. Another student agreed, while a third chimed in, noting that Ed had always exhibited that kind of behavior from the very beginning. Upon hearing the audience's comments, Phenia agreed with their assessment of Ed. She believed he used his position to embarrass his juniors, and when his efforts failed, he was caught altering test results, which led to his reputation as a shameless person. Phenia recalled that Ed had indeed acted like that in the past, but after observing him more closely in recent days, she began to question whether that was truly who he was. She considered that Ed's earlier interaction with Taylor wasn't an attempt to mock him but stemmed from desperation. Phenia recognized that Ed's words to Taylor had been the truth, not lies. Just then, an announcement was made, signaling the start of the combat between Ed and Phenia. Phenia, activating her magic, expressed her confusion about Ed, stating that she couldn't understand his thoughts. She told him that she wanted to reach a conclusion through their duel, which surprised Ed. At that moment, Phenia announced that she was going to attack him. Remembering that Ed could wield wind and fire magic, she wondered how he would respond to her impending assault. Phenia resolved to shake off her doubts during their exchange and envisioned a dramatic battle as a finale. Through this confrontation, she hoped to rid herself of the mysterious figure that Ed represented in her heart. As Phenia launched her magic toward him, the attack hit Ed directly, leaving him lying on the ground. In that moment, he announced his defeat, leaving Phenia in disbelief. She couldn't comprehend how Ed had failed to block her attack despite clearly seeing the trajectory of the water ball. The audience erupted in laughter, declaring that Ed was even worse than Taylor, noting that he had acted cool only to be knocked out with a single hit. Meanwhile, they praised Phenia, calling her impressive and refreshing for putting Ed in his place. After getting up, Ed told Phenia that it had been a good fight and that he had learned a lot from the experience. However, Phenia felt unsatisfied with the outcome, still confused about Ed's true intentions even after the duel. It dawned on her that he had shown no interest in the fight from the beginning and had not made eye contact with her even once. An announcement was made, declaring Phenia as the winner. As the duel concluded, Ed was seen running down the hallway, thinking to himself that when interacting with Princess Phenia, he needed to be cautious to avoid disrupting the scenario, as she was a key figure in the story. At that moment, Ed realized that someone even more important than Phenia was Taylor, the main protagonist of the game. He began to panic as he searched for Taylor. While looking around, Ed heard a voice calling out to him. Turning toward the sound, he saw Phenia, breathing heavily as if she had been running. She asked Ed what he was doing in the area without an escort and angrily demanded to know who he was. Confused by Phenia's behavior, Ed replied that he didn't understand what she meant but that he had learned a lot from their fight. This only made Phenia angrier, and she asked him what he had possibly learned, pointing out that he had clearly not wanted to win in the first place and questioning how he could have gained any knowledge from the experience. Phenia then shouted at Ed in anger, accusing him of only thinking about how to quickly exit the stage during their entire duel. She expressed her frustrations about already struggling to keep up with her classes and dealing with the troublesome fox-like merchant student, Lortel, and Professor Glast. On top of that, the servants constantly lectured her on the ways of royalty. With all of this weighing on her, Phinia felt even more troubled by Ed complicating her thoughts, leaving her unable to discern his intentions. Even if she were to use her innate skill on him, she still wouldn't understand what Ed was planning. Surprised by Phinia's outburst, Ed realized just how much pent-up frustration she had been carrying. As Ed heard what Phinia said, he stepped closer and placed his hands on her shoulders. He gently told her to take a deep breath and to calm down, assuring her that there was no need to get so worked up. Phinia was surprised by his words. Ed encouraged her to breathe in and out to help her relax, and after a few moments, she began to calm down. Although she felt embarrassed about the situation, Phinia eventually told Ed to forget everything that had just happened between them. Ed then thought to himself that since the situation had settled, he could finally leave. However, Phinia interrupted him, admitting that she had always struggled with this bad habit. Phinia continued by explaining that while she could ask questions bluntly, she often felt like she was constantly trying to guess what others were thinking, likely a result of her long life in the palace. Ed appeared troubled, eager to leave and find Taylor instead of listening to her. Phinia then became serious and stated that she would ask Ed directly. She pointed her finger at him and asserted that he had deliberately tried to sever ties with his family because he was aware of their dark side and no longer wanted to associate with them. Phinia added that Ed's tendency to pick on Taylor stemmed from his desire to find a reason to be expelled from the family. Ed thought to himself that Phinia had made a rather sharp deduction. Although most of what she said was incorrect, it was true that his family had a dark side. However, he quickly changed his expression and told her that he did not understand what she was talking about. He realized that revealing the truth was not an option, it was something Phinia would have to uncover on her own in the future, as it was too early for him to share it with her. Phinia, upon hearing Ed's response, became furious and insisted that there was no way she could be wrong. She argued that her explanation was the only logical conclusion she could draw about him. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.